Hey, Professor Carafit here, coming to you from the biology bunker. Uh, we need to wrap up the lecture that we left off on before we all split town. So remember that plants have root hairs on the roots. So this root right here, that's a multicellular organ, but these hairs are single celled. They're single cells sticking out of that root, and they allow it to absorb lots of water, lots of surface area. Now, we can also increase surface area with mycorrhizae, as we see on this slide. These are fungal hyphae, also making the surface area of the root much larger than it would have been. So water comes into those roots. Now, at the middle of that root is a tissue known as xylem. The xylem has lots of different kinds of cells, but the major cells that we see here have thick walls, or at least rings of thickenings that make them very strong, but when they function for the plant, they're dead, meaning their cytoplasm is empty, and they're like big empty drinking straws lined up end to end in that plant from the roots all the way to the leaves. And that forms the tissue called xylem, and the major function of that xylem is water conduction. Now, I want to point out that that xylem transports water, acts as structural support, and it does this because of the properties of water molecules, which I'm sure you remember from Bio 1. Water molecules have partial positive on one end and a partial negative charge. This is hard. I'm drawing with a mouse right now. Partial negative on the other side. And that allows water to stick to itself and stick to the polar walls of xylem that we see there. That puts that plant under a lot of tension, by the way, all that water under tension in those tubes. Now, this leads us to the cohesion tension hypothesis, then, how we think water moves through a plant. So water sticks to itself, it sticks to the lignin and cellulose of the cell walls of the plant, and as water evaporates out of the stomata and the leaves, it pulls water up the water column, and that allows more water to come into the roots, and water moves up the xylem, and some of it evaporates. Some of the water, of course, gets used by the plant for photosynthesis and things, but some of it evaporates out into the atmosphere, and this creates a negative pressure, just like drinking on a drinking straw, a negative pressure. So if you poked a hole in xylem, air would get sucked in, and the xylem would quit working. So minerals and water come in and evaporate out the top. Boop. Right? And we can see that here once again in a different slide. Water comes in, up the xylem, evaporates out of the leaves, and that's how water moves from the bottom of a giant redwood tree to the top. Now, phloem is a living tissue. Phloem is a living tissue that transports sugars from the top of the plant towards the roots, typically, although it can go backwards. And so what happens is that sugars are actively pumped, so remember active transport from Bio 1, into the phloem, and that creates a very sugary cell, so water is going to follow thanks to osmosis. And we call these areas where sugars are pumped in, we call that a source. Meanwhile, on the other side of the plant, sugars are being pumped out of cells, and therefore water follows, and they call that a sink. And this results in bulk flow. Bulk flow is the movement from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So up here, pressure is high because water is flowing in because sugar's been pumped in and osmosis happens. And down here, pressure is low. So we flow from high to low. Just like from the high pressure end of a garden hose, that's where the faucet is, to the low pressure, and that's where water can get out and spread out and lose pressure. So phloem flows from the source towards the sink. So we see here we have some phloem. These are phloem cells here, and over here xylem cells on the left. And so what we have here is the loading of sugar, step one. So that means sucrose is pumped into the phloem, lots of sucrose. Water flows from the xylem into the phloem because of osmosis, and that creates a high pressure up here. Then down here, sugar is being offloaded. It's being pumped out, and therefore water diffuses out back into the xylem again, and that creates a pressure differential from up here where pressure is high and down here where pressure is low. and so everything flows in that direction. However, if you were to poke a hole in this, it would act different than xylem. Why? Because this is a positive pressure system. If I poke a hole into some phloem, so let's say we have some phloem right here, I poke a hole in it, water is going to spurt out. It's like poking a hole in a garden hose. And we figured that out by studying aphids, these insects that have long beaks, they're called a proboscis, and they stab it in. They're like vampires. They stab it into the plants, like a lot of garden plants. You'll have aphid problems or house plants. And what they do is they stick their proboscis in there, and the sugars in the phloem will push into the bug, push right into the aphid, and actually some of it will leak out the backside. And this is sugary water leaking out of the back of the aphid called honeydew. And the way we studied phloem and learned about how it worked is we would actually cut off aphids' heads, basically right here, and leave their proboscis stuck in there, and then we could sample what came out of that proboscis and see how it worked and how much pressure it was under. So aphids take advantage of that pressure, and they use it to allow the sugary water of a plant to push right in. Now, if you have aphid problems, what happens sometimes is this honeydew gets onto the plant, and then fungus starts to grow on that sugary honeydew, leading to mold problems and plant diseases. Now, in the daytime, as we said, the leaves are the source. And down here, the roots, or in this case, the potatoes, are the sink. So sugar is flowing down and being stored as starch in those potatoes. But at nighttime, now the potatoes are releasing sugars, and the leaves aren't making any, but they still need to eat, so sugars are flowing upward up the phloem because the leaves become the sink, and now the potatoes are the source. So water can flow in both, or sugary water basically in the phloem can flow in both directions. Now there's a question here that you can try to answer. I'm going to let you look at it, I'm going to let you study it, and you can pause the video. It's a hard one, but if you understand biology, it's not very hard. But don't be ashamed if it seems really hard at first. All right, the answer to this question, how do you answer it? So you have 3 identical plates stuck in identical conditions. Seeds that were given light and no water, seeds that were given light and water, and seeds that were given light but no water. And they ask, what would their dry weights be in increasing order? So by dry weight, we mean we dry them out and weigh just the biomass, the carbon that's left behind. Number 1 would be this one right here. It has light and water. So those seeds grew, they photosynthesized, they made more and more and more carbohydrates that are found in the cell walls of those seedlings. That's the heaviest one. The second heaviest one, the one that would weigh second in mass, would be this one. Number 2, the seeds all by themselves, and number 3, this one. Why? Well, those seeds contain a whole bunch of stored food for the embryo. So they're pretty heavy then, right? So they start to grow, like in number 3, they started to grow. They started to eat that stored food, but they were never able to photosynthesize. So they released a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. They lost a bunch of mass because of that CO2 being lost as they respired eating that food, but they were never able to make more carbon thanks to photosynthesis. Therefore, these, and number 3, those plants right there, weigh less than the seeds from which they grew. Biology. All right, I'll catch you next time. Oh, this is from a previous slide that you don't need to worry about unless you don't remember how to interpret a null hypothesis. All right, I'll see you later.